Hi BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. We're going to stretch ourselves just a little today, cover 4.5 pages so that we can get to the end of chapter 23. To my mind, this is really just a way of making an unhappy event that much shorter. The unhappy event that we all know is going to happen, even if this is our first time to read Middlemarch. We've gotten to know Fred Vincy rather well, and the signs of impending disaster, they're all there. I don't think I've ever talked about all the stages that I go through to prepare for a Middlemarch meditation. The first thing I do is skim read ahead and my aim is really just to seek the next cutoff point. How many pages should make the next episode? And that might depend upon structure. It might depend upon where there's a transition in the narrative. I'm trying not to cover too many pages. So I'm also in my skim read checking to see, is there going to be a lot of material here where background research is needed, where a lot of rabbit holes are needed, because you don't want to cover too many pages. You end up with a meditation that's an hour long or more, and I've had some of those, but looking back, I think that's a long time to ask people to engage with you. So I'm really trying to keep these meditations shorter and choose the amount of content we cover accordingly. After that, I do a second, slower reading, and now I'm marking the text. I'm looking actively for what do I want to highlight here in terms of the language or maybe sentence structure. We've talked about sentence structure before. Or, of course, there's inevitably terms that Eliot uses, which were either more familiar in her day or they pertain to a historical event that not everybody might be aware of, etc., etc. The kind of thing that I have to go to JSTOR and all over the internet to find information about. But I always find really good information. And then I open up an Excel spreadsheet. Of course I do. It's amazing, but I do find spreadsheets work better for scripts, and that's because I'm working in clips, but also because we're covering different pages of the text, or sometimes an epigraph. I can create, if you've seen an Excel spreadsheet, if you haven't, this explanation isn't going to really be meaningful, but Excel is basically graph paper, electronic graph paper, but you can create several different pages. So I can have a page where I just set out to cover epigraphs. I can have a page just for talking about anything that's happening on, for example, today we're covering page 236 as it happens. So I'll have a separate page for that. I'll have a separate page for everything that needs to appear in the description box. So by the time I come to posting the video, when I'm done filming and editing and so on, I just have to go to that page that is about the description box, quickly copy everything that's in there because it's already laid out, already has hyperlinks, and I just paste it into my description box, knowing that I've got everything that I talked about in the video. And so the script grows gradually because I don't just have those two readings of the text. There's often a third and a fourth reading of just those few pages to try to make sure I pull out as much as I can for you. So the script develops gradually. Anyway, that's enough of that. I just thought that was a by the by. What we'll do now is we'll go ahead and read the text from page 236 till the end of chapter 23. Most of those who saw Fred riding out of Middlemarch in company with Bambridge and Horrocks on his way, of course, to Houndsley horse fair, thought that young Vincy was pleasure-seeking as usual, and but for an unwanted consciousness of grave matters on hand, he himself would have had a sense of dissipation and of doing what might be expected of a gay young fellow. Considering that Fred was not at all coarse, that he rather looked down on the manners and speech of young men who had not been to the university, and that he had written stanzas, as pastoral and unvoluptuous as his flute playing, his attraction towards Bambridge and Horrocks was an interesting fact which even the love of horseflesh would not wholly account for without that mysterious influence of naming which determines so much of mortal choice. Under any other name than pleasure, the society of Messrs. Bambridge and Horrocks most certainly have been regarded as monotonous, and to arrive with them at Houndsley on a drizzling afternoon to get down at the Red Lion in a street shaded with coal dust, and dine in a room furnished with a dirt-enameled map of the county, a bad portrait of an anonymous horse in a stable, His Majesty George IV with legs and cravat, and various leaden spittoons, might have seemed a hard business, but for the sustaining power of nomenclature, which determined that the pursuit of these things was gay. In Mr. Horrocks there was certainly an apparent unfathomableness which offered play to the imagination. Costume, at a glance, gave him a thrilling association with horses, enough to specify the hat brim, which took the slightest upward angle just to escape the suspicion of bending downwards, and nature had given him a face which, by dint of Mongolian eyes and a nose, mouth, and chin seeming to follow his hat brim in a moderate inclination upwards, gave the effect of a subdued, unchangeable, sceptical smile, of all expressions the most tyrannous over a susceptible mind, and, when accompanied by adequate silence, likely to create the reputation of an invincible understanding, an infinite fund of humour, too dry to flow, and probably in a state of immovable crust, and a critical judgment which, if you could ever be fortunate enough to know it, would be the thing and no other. It is a physiognomy seen in all vocations, but perhaps it has never been more powerful over the youth of England than in the judge of horses. Mr. Horrocks, at a question from Fred about his horse's fetlock, turned sideways in his saddle and watched the horse's action for the space of 3 minutes, then turned forward, twitched his own bridle, and remained silent, with a profile neither more nor less sceptical than it had been. The part thus played in dialogue by Mr. Horrocks was terribly effective. A mixture of passions was excited in Fred, a mad desire to thrash Horrocks' opinion into utterance, restrained by anxiety to retain the advantage of his friendship. There was always the chance that Horrocks might say something quite invaluable at the right moment. Mr. Bambridge had more open manners, and appeared to give forth his ideas without economy. He was loud, robust, and was sometimes spoken of as being given to indulgence, chiefly in swearing, drinking, and beating his wife. Some people who had lost by him called him a vicious man, but he regarded horse-dealing as the finest of the arts, and might have argued plausibly that it had nothing to do with morality. He was undeniably a prosperous man, bore his drinking better than others bore their moderation, and on the whole flourished like the green bay tree. But his range of conversation was limited, and like the fine old tune, Drops of Brandy, gave you after a while a sense of returning upon itself in a way that might make weak heads dizzy. But a slight infusion of Mr. Bambridge was felt to give tone and character to several circles in Middlemarch, and he was a distinguished figure in the bar and billiard-room at the Green Dragon. He knew some anecdotes about the heroes of the turf, and various clever tricks of marquesses and viscounts, which seemed to prove that blood asserted its preeminence even among blacklegs. But the minute retentiveness of his memory was chiefly shown about the horses he had himself bought and sold, the number of miles they would trot you in no time without turning a hair, being, after the lapse of years, still a subject of passionate asseveration, in which he would assist the imagination of his hearers by solemnly swearing that they never saw anything like it. In short, Mr. Bambridge was a man of pleasure and a gay companion. Fred was subtle, and did not tell his friends that he was going to Houndsley bent on selling his horse. He wished to get indirectly at their genuine opinion of its value, not being aware that a genuine opinion was the last thing likely to be extracted from such eminent critics. It was not Mr. Bambridge's weakness to be a gratuitous flatterer. He had never before been so much struck with the fact that this unfortunate bay was a roarer to a degree which required the roundest word for perdition to give you any idea of it. You made a bad hand at swapping when you went to anybody but me, Vincey. Why, you never threw your leg across a finer horse than that chestnut, but you gave him for this brute. If you set him cantering, he goes on like 20 sores. I never heard but one worse roarer in my life, and that was a roan. It belonged to Pegwell, the corn factor. He used to drive him in his gig 7 years ago, and he wanted me to take him, but I said, "Thank you, Peg. I don't deal in wind instruments." That was what I said. It went the round of the country, that joke did. But what the hell? The horse was a penny trumpet to that roarer of yours. Why, you said just now his was worse than mine, said Fred, more irritable than usual. I said a lie, then, said Mr. Bambridge emphatically. There wasn't a penny to choose between 'em. Fred spurred his horse, and they trotted on a little way. When they slackened again, Mr. Bambridge said, "Not but what the roan was a better trotter than yours. I'm quite satisfied with his paces, I know," said Fred, who required all the consciousness of being in gay company to support him. "I say, his trot is an uncommonly clean one, eh, Horrock?" Mr. Horrock looked before him with as complete a neutrality as if he had been a portrait by a great master. Fred gave up the fallacious hope of getting a genuine opinion, but on reflection he saw that Bambridge's depreciation and Horrock's silence were both virtually encouraging, and indicated that they thought better of the horse than they chose to say. That very evening, indeed, before the fair had set in, Fred thought he saw a favourable opening for disposing advantageously of his horse, but an opening which made him congratulate himself on his foresight in bringing with him his £80. A young farmer, acquainted with Mr. Bambridge, came into the Red Lion and entered into conversation about parting with a hunter, which he introduced at once as Diamond, implying that it was a public character. For himself, he only wanted a useful hack which would draw upon occasion, being about to marry, and to give up hunting. The hunter was in a friend's stable at some little distance. There was still time for gentlemen to see it before dark. The friend's stable had to be reached through a back street where you might as easily have been poisoned without expensive drugs as in any grim street of that unsanitary period. Fred was not fortified against disgust by brandy as his companions were, but the hope of having at last seen the horse that would enable him to make money was exhilarating enough to lead him over the same ground again the first thing in the morning. He felt sure that if he did not come to a bargain with the farmer, Bambridge would, for the stress of circumstances Fred felt was sharpening his acuteness and endowing him with all the constructive power of suspicion. Bambridge had run down Diamond in a way that he never would have done, the horse being a friend's, if he had not thought of buying it. Everyone who looked at the animal, even Horrock, was evidently impressed with its merit. To get all the advantage of being with men of this sort, you must know how to draw your inferences, and not be a spoon who takes things literally. The colour of the horse was a dappled grey, and Fred happened to know that Lord Medlicott's man was on the lookout for just such a horse. After all his running down, Bambridge let it out in the course of the evening, when the farmer was absent, that he had seen worse horses go for £80. Of course, he contradicted himself 20 times over, but when you know what is likely to be true, you can test a man's admissions, and Fred could not but reckon his own judgment of a horse was worth something. The farmer had paused over Fred's respectable, though broken-winded Steve long enough to show that he thought it worth consideration, and it seemed probable that he would take it, with £25 in addition, as the equivalent of Diamond. In that case, Fred, when he had parted with his new horse for at least £80, would be £55 in pocket by the transaction, and would have £135 towards the meeting of the bill, so that the deficit temporarily thrown on Mr. Garth would at the utmost be £25. By the time he was hurrying on his clothes in the morning, he saw so clearly the importance of not losing this rare chance that if Bambridge and Horrock had both dissuaded him, he would not have been deluded into a direct interpretation of their purpose. He would have been aware that those deep hands held something else than a young fellow's interest. With regard to horses, distrust was your only clue, but skepticism, as we know, can never be thoroughly applied, else life would come to a standstill. Something we must believe in and do, and whatever that something may be called, it is virtually our own judgment, even when it seems like the most slavish reliance on another. Fred believed in the excellence of his bargain, and even before the fare had well set in, had got possession of the dappled grey at the price of his old horse, and £30 in addition, only £5 more than he had expected to give. But he felt a little worried and wearied, perhaps with mental debate, and without waiting for the further gaieties of the horse fair, he set out alone on his 14 miles journey, meaning to take it very quietly and keep his horse fresh. Okay, now we shall look at some little interesting things from page 236. At the top, of course, it wants us to know that Fred was not at all coarse, and by coarse they mean lacking in refinement, crude, vulgar. That comes from the good old 1811 Dictionary of the Common Tongue. Very helpful book, by the way. I'm really finding a lot of good stuff in there as definitions of everyday idioms and phrases used in the early 19th century. And then it goes down and talks about how the company of Bambridge and Horrock, no one would understand how it could be pleasurable unless you had already named the occasion pleasurable. So it talks about the mysterious influence of naming. By naming this a pleasure trip, suddenly the company of these men, it improves. And although Eliot's narrator said it only improves because you've named this a pleasant occasion, nothing that the men themselves bring makes it any better. I was interested in how the interior of the Red Lion was described. Of course, that's a pub. It's worth saying, actually, that the number of pubs in the United Kingdom at the start of the 19th century was much, much higher than now. This is a late statistic, but in 1870, so we're talking about 40 years later, in the UK it was estimated there was one pub for every 130 people, or about 115,000. Now, if you compare that with now, when the population is much higher, there are only about 45,000 pubs, or one for every 1,000 adults. It was so much more of a social hub for people, and probably the only place to go for a working class man for entertainment outside of the larger cities. And the aesthetic of pubs has also changed. It's got better, frankly. Eliot's narrator talks about a street shaded with coal dust. Well, people, of course, burn coal for household heating. Factories burn coal to run machinery. It filled the air with this deadly smog. Anybody that watches videos about London in the 1950s will see plenty of material on YouTube right now about that smog. And, of course, it stained buildings, roads, people, if they spent very long outdoors. So if we look at it, he's got inside this pub this dirt enameled map of the county. So I think it probably is a framed print, but it's been sitting up on the wall so long and gathering so much coal dust, not to mention tobacco smoke, because people would have smoked in there. That's also one different aesthetic of pubs. There's no more smoking allowed in them. And then he talks about this portrait of His Majesty King George IV with legs and cravat, as if there isn't really anything else noted or noteworthy about the portrait. Well, I think I found the painting that this pub must have had a printed copy of, and I'm putting it on screen now. Just because you can't help but notice, as soon as I thought legs and cravat, I looked at many, many other portraits of King George IV, and what he's wearing is somewhat different, and it did not stand out to me, whereas with this painting, immediately I thought, oh yes, I wonder if they even called it at that time the legs and cravat painting, because it's just, that's where your eye goes, up to his neck, because he seems to have an impossibly long neck, and then he also seems to have these incredible legs, as if I wanted to see what the quality and shape of George IV's legs were. George IV died in 1830, and if I remember correctly, where we are now in Middlemarch is around about 1832. I wouldn't read too much into that, by the way. That doesn't mean this pub is somehow disloyal to the new king. It was just probably they're out of... It sounds like everything in that pub is just a little bit grime covered and just getting on a bit. And so it's not surprising that they don't yet have a portrait of the new king hanging up. They've still got the previous king's portrait showing, among other things. It's just a very grimy place. And also they talk about the various leaden spittoons that are around. These are vessels on the floor that people were meant to spit in, which of course leads me to the next subject. Why did people spit more in the 19th century? Why was that socially acceptable? And this you have to trace back in history. Some people may already know this, so apologies to those who like, oh, well, don't you know? Saliva was regarded very differently in history. Yes, it was. And you will find a link in my description box to an article titled The Bizarre Cultural History of Saliva. Yes, you never knew you needed it, but I did. And I read through it and I realized that going back, they could trace back to as far as Roman times, this sense that saliva had curative properties, but also by the 19th century, it had gained a bit of a reputation as being something you should expel from the body regularly. And I'm reading a passage now from the article. It says, as late as the middle of the 19th century, we find the therapeutic prestige of saliva undiminished. Nicholas Robinson, an English medical author who signs his book simply as a physician, extols enthusiastically the virtues of saliva, which he calls a recrement. And this word, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, has been in circulation since at least 1599, and it means the superfluous or useless portion of any substance. So in other words, saliva was something that your body needed to make. They seemed to feel that was very important, and there was a certain prestige to it as a product of the body. But then it was important to expel it. And so these spittoons existed because it prevented people otherwise from just spitting on the floor. The floor in most pubs at that time would have been packed dirt, possibly stone, but not likely, covered in sawdust so that it could be swept and more put out, to get rid of food waste and other things. I'm not going to go there. All right. Do you really want me to tell you what happens when people drink alcohol and what else might stain the floor and it'd be nice to sweep up? No, I don't, right? I'll just leave that to your imagination. Anyway, they wouldn't have been very lovely places. And in addition to all the stuff that already went on the floor and needed sweeping up, people also spat frequently because they believed it was good. In addition, they had more smoking habits. Pipe smoking was very common. So was chewing tobacco. And that created extra saliva. So if you had these spittoons around, it encouraged people to use them rather than spitting on the floor. Although it still was disgusting. It meant that you had to empty them out. And I don't like imagining that. And near the bottom of page 236, Eliot's narrator begins these long descriptions of Horrocks first and then Bambridge. I would love to know the real persons Eliot based these characters on. I just feel, yes, they could be 100% imagined, of course, but it's just the unusual details like the angle of Mr. Horrocks' hat brim. And when Eliot describes Mr. Horrocks as having Mongolian eyes, is she using that term in the ethnic sense? Or is she talking about what is now a rejected term? We used to refer to anyone with Down syndrome. I'd say back in the 50s and the 60s, by the time I remember I was growing up in the 70s, I never heard anyone using that term. They talked about children having Down syndrome. But I say previous, say to the 1960s, they referred to as Mongol or Mongoloid. So is she talking about them having eyes like someone with Down syndrome would have, or eyes like someone who's ethnically Mongolian? And when I look back, I think most likely the former, ethnic Mongolian. Dr. John Langdon Down, who first studied the symptoms, although he didn't name it after himself, he was the first person to use the term Mongolian to describe the symptoms of what is now Down syndrome. And so he didn't begin his medical career until the mid-1840s, and he didn't publish his paper about the symptoms until 1866. So, okay, Middlemarch was published in 1871, and there was time for Eliot to acquaint herself with Dr. Down and his writings, yes. But since she is harking back to the 1830s, I just think it's safe to assume that what she's trying to describe with Mr. Horrock is eyes with an epicanthic fold of some kind. And it does occur in Northern Europe. About 2 to 3% of the population in Northern Europe have eyes with some kind of epicanthic fold. And here you see a photograph of some different white European eyes, differing degrees and shape of that epicanthic fold. But there was actually a really good video by a guy who is, I think his mum is Chinese, his dad is Japanese, and he does a fantastic channel where he discusses in detail the epicanthic fold and its different shapes in Asian eyes, as well as where it occurs around the world. And that was fascinating watch. If I remember, I'll put that in my description box, because it taught me a load of things, as just about everything I find on YouTube does. Having dealt with Mr. Horrock, Eliot's narrator goes on to Mr. Bambridge, doesn't so much describe his appearance. That's what makes me think Horrock might be based on a real person. Bambridge might also, but Eliot's narrator wants to talk more about his personality, his character. And I found a book online that I think might have been written by Mr. Bambridge if he had in fact existed. It's called Confessions of a Horse Dealer, and it's written by Frederick Taylor. It was published by John Blackwoods in London, so the same publisher who published Eliot's novels. The year of publication, it's not printed inside the book that's online, but I found a couple of websites which one says 1860, the other says 1861, so certainly mid-century, and the prose sounds mid-19th century. About half of the book is made up with the kind of anecdotes that I think Mr. Bambridge, it sounds like he talks about, the horses that he has bought and sold. The book had anecdotes about the horse trade, revealing lots of the different tricks and setups that horse dealers use to distract or deceive a buyer, to show a horse in such a way that its faults are less likely to be noticed, right? And how to disguise a horse's age as well. I didn't know that, or the fact that it maybe has an injury or an illness or an infection of some kind. And then the second half of the book is a series of short essays about the best way to breed, to raise and to train horses, and how to pick the best horse for certain types of work. If you're interested, there will be a link in my description box, yes, to the full text of that book online. But if you want a hard copy, I noticed that Amazon are selling a reprinted paperback and a Kindle version. And also you can find older print copies online. They're a little pricey because there aren't very many of them around. So it depends how much you need a physical copy of the book, but it is there. And I read, I'd say, about 3 full chapters of Frederick Taylor's book. The first 3, where he's giving all these different anecdotes about how horses are sold and some of the tricks of the horse traders. And as I was reading it, I thought, wait a minute, is what Eliot's narrator describing here, the scene with the young farmer who comes into the pub, talks to Mr. Bambridge, says, oh, I have this hunter that needs to sell. I thought, is this a setup? Is this a setup? And I'll tell you why. There's an anecdote that Frederick Taylor tells where he says it's often the case that horse traders, in order to lower a potential buyer's suspicion, they will make out that the horse they're selling is not theirs, that they're helping a friend. And he gave one instance where there was a horse dealer who knew a grocer, and that grocer, of course, owned a cart, had his own horse, and that horse and cart went round daily, of course, to deliver fruit and vegetables or to travel to various marketplaces to sell his wares. And the horse dealer said, hey, I'll make you a deal. This will be worth it for you and me. He said, I want you to bring your cart with me to the horse fair. I've got a horse to sell. He said, well, then when we get to town, when we get to the town, he said, I want you to swap out. I want you to put my horse in harness on your cart, tie it up somewhere, give it a nose bag. He said, I'm going to move around the fair. And what the horse trader does is he looks out for someone who, as they're walking through the fairgrounds and they're checking on horses for sale, he can tell that they're probably looking for a working cart horse just by the kinds of animals they're taking a closer look at. And then the horse trader will approach this person who's browsing, if you will, at the fair and say to him, "Hey, are you in the market? Are you looking out for a good cart horse for work?" And if the person says, "Yes, I am," the horse trader will say, "Well, I have a friend who would like to sell their horse, and he's in town right now, and the horse is working, so you'll be able to see it in harness. Would you be interested in going to see him?" And of course, this immediately creates a different, because in the horse fair, everyone came with a sense of caution that they might be cheated by horse traders. But this approach makes it seem as though because you're being pulled out of the fair to meet a private individual who wants to sell their own working animal, you think, I'm probably going to see a genuinely good piece of horse flesh, something suited for the work that I want them to do. So that the horse trader would then lead the suspect, the poor unsuspecting buyer, to the grocer's cart, introduce, have a chat. The grocer, of course, would pretend that this was his horse, and yes, he needs to move it on. I don't know what story they would come up with as to why, but they'd come up with some plausible story. And so the sale would happen with the buyer always thinking that this horse actually belonged to the grocer and was the animal that he used daily in his work, when that wasn't the case. Now, this could also be true for this setup that happens at the end of chapter 23. The farmer may not have owned that dapple grey horse, but he could easily have stabled it on his farm and said that he did. And then, of course, he knows where to find Bambridge. They've already talked. They've already arranged this. Maybe they've arranged it specifically for Fred, because as much as Fred believes that he's so worldly wise and doesn't give anything away, Bambridge and Horrocks Fred to me seems quite transparent. I think I could read Fred and I could figure out ways to trick him, because he doesn't seem to be a person who keeps too much to himself when maybe he should. I think Bambridge and Horrocks know perfectly well why Fred is on his way to the fair, and they think we can set him up. We can set him up because he's gullible. They know that he's made bad bargains buying horses in the past and exchanging. In fact, they probably know the horse traders he deals with, and I can just imagine they know Fred better than Fred realizes he is known. And it's possible that this could be a setup, that the young farmer has agreed to put a horse belonging to Bambridge or Horrocks in his stable, and the whole ruse is set up so it appears to be the farmer's horse and not belonging to Bambridge or Horrocks. And so Fred goes there and they all have a look at the horse, and Bambridge and Horrocks, they're kind of, don't know. They say that while they're present with the farmer, and then later on that evening, when the farmer isn't present, Bambridge says something like, "Well, I've seen worse horses go for £80. And he's that remark, I think, is putting a seed in Fred's mind. This horse is better than I, Bambridge, made the animal out to be when I saw it in the presence of the man who wanted to sell it." And so Fred begins to get this suspicion, they want to buy that dapple grey hunter, but that might be a fantastic hunter, and I think I should go out and get it before they buy it. And the funny thing is, he does manage to do that and make that exchange. And it's interesting that the price goes up ever so slightly. You remember how Fred first thought he'd just have to pay an additional £25, that Diamond would be bought for the value of his horse plus £25. And then when he actually goes to clinch the deal, the £25 suddenly becomes 30. And Fred doesn't argue that. And I wondered if that was somebody's commission. If adding that extra £5 on was the young farmer's commission for cooperating, that would have been a lot of money. I mean, it doesn't sound like much now, but it would have been a lot of money for a young farmer. And so it's interesting, it might have been the money he needed for something for his wedding, if he was really getting married. I mean, there's no way to prove that. And Fred is 14 miles away from home, so he has no idea. And I just wonder, Middlemarch Meditation Watchers, this is one of those little editing videos, because I realize I left out, just defining a term, it was on page 237, where Mr. Bambridge is being described, and it talks about how he has anecdotes about the horses and the turf. And it says he knew some anecdotes about the heroes of the turf and various clever tricks of marquesses and viscounts, which seemed to prove that blood asserted its preeminence even among blacklegs. And I thought, blacklegs, what did he mean by that? That other horse traders were described as blacklegs. The implication being a little sinister, meaning a little bit tricksy. But he seems to be saying that there were members of the aristocracy who engaged in horse trading themselves, or they always came good. I'm not sure which one it was. It's not really clear from the narration, but that's the meaning of that term blackleg. So this little clip is going to insert itself, even though it was made much later than the original filming. I think what I'll do is close our meditation today by quoting from the very opening paragraphs of Frederick Taylor's books about horse trading, where he says, "There are at least 500 fools born every day, and the longer I live, the more I feel convinced that this assertion is true. But of another thing, I feel equally certain that in the population of the United Kingdom, indeed, I may venture to say, the whole human race, there are at least 2 rogues for 1 fool. The fool has generally his money ready got for him, by some means or another, often in the form of an annuity." So what he's saying is there are loads of fools around, but you can tell a fool if he has money. The implication being the fool doesn't earn his money, and which would require some kind of ability on his part in order to earn it in the first place. And also because he hasn't earned it, there's maybe less reluctance to part with that money for a bad product. That the fool is someone who they don't really understand the value of money because they haven't had to work for it, and they don't really understand how to look after it, how to make sure you don't spend it unwisely. So his book is a fantastic read if you wanted to just have a peek and even read one of the chapters, because they're very short. I think you'll find it really amusing what the profession of horse trading was like mid-19th century. And I think the other interesting telling fact is that Fred then didn't stay for the fair really at all. He decided, I've got my horse, I'm going to ride straight back home on it, and he does. And I'm pretty sure that for Bambridge and Horrocks, that was a win. I don't know. I may be wrong. Maybe we won't find any evidence to back that up later in the novel, but I just wondered, having read Frederick Taylor's account of horse dealers and how they do their business, I just thought, Elliot would know that. Her father's business meant she wouldn't have gone to a horse fair herself. I very much doubt that a young lady of her class, even though her father would have gone as part of his business, no doubt her older brother would have gone. Yes, they would have had to have done that as part of their jobs, to make sure the farm had animals and was selling its animals well. They may even have worked through horse traders, used horse traders to sell their animals for them. I don't know. That'd be interesting. But I think Marion obviously picked up enough to know those tricks of the trade herself. And that is pretty much all I have to say about that section of the book. We just now wait to see what will be the problem, because you just know there'll be a problem. It even ends that last paragraph saying that Fred was a little worried and wearied. And I wonder if deep down in his gut, he just thought, I've made another one of these bad decisions. Perhaps he just lacks confidence because he knows about his bad decisions in the past. He seems so confident when he does get these feelings that his judgment is good. But I wonder if he really, truly believes in his own ability to make good judgments. So that's it, everybody. Now we'll just hold off until the end of February, and we'll get a chance then to start chapter 24 and find out all the horribleness which does occur. So check out the links in the description box. They are all really interesting. I have to sit down now and write a script, or there will not be any material for midweek. I've read lots of books, and I'm sort of partway through about 3 different scripts. I've got to get one of them at least finished off, polished up, and recorded midweek for you. So it will be, I think it'll most likely be a fiction review, because the nonfiction book I'm reading right now, I haven't quite finished. So it'll either be a book review of Robert Heinlein's The Man Who Sold the Moon, that collection of short stories, or it will be a YA novel. And I'll just leave that one as a big question mark, because that will be more likely. So I'll just leave that as a mystery, because I like a good mystery, as you know. In the meantime, everybody, good reading. As I'm going to see you all in a few days' time. Take care, please. Bye-bye.